Do you enjoy creepy horror stories? Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spooky videos from Scare Street.
In Rose Hall by Ron Ripley. Why? His mother's question was, as always, short and to the point. Jimmy Sue stood in front of her, his hands clasped behind his back, and he knew he could not lie to her. He had never been able to, and so he did not try. "I have read an anecdote concerning Rose Hall," he stated, his voice revealing the faintest of cracks, the hint of adolescence creeping up on him. "It is said there is a ghost who dwells within the hall. I would like to ascertain whether this is a truthful statement or one which is false." His mother frowned and put down the book she had been reading. She brushed a strand of her black hair away from her face and tucked it behind her ear with a momentary expression of frustration. "Where is this place again?" "It is on the far northern side of Anger," Jimmy explained. "Once there was a private school there, but it has closed down." "King's Academy?" his mother asked with a raised eyebrow. Jimmy nodded. "You would need to gain permission from whoever owns the building, correct?" "Yes. I spoke with Mr. Tate, and he informed me that it is the town that now owns the property. It was donated to Anger," Jimmy stated. She scratched the tip of her nose absently, an act which showed him she was seriously considering his request rather than dismissing it out of hand. "Mr. Tate, as in Mr. Dan Tate, the librarian, correct?" Jimmy nodded. "Yes. He says the man in the office owes him a favor, though he did not say what the favor was or why." A small smile flashed across his mother's face. "Ah, you will be escorted by an adult?" Jimmy frowned. "I did not think an escort was necessary." Her eyes narrowed. "And why not?" "The buildings are not in a state of disrepair," Jimmy stated, "nor are they open to the public. I would go into Rose Hall, examine it, and leave." "You need an adult with you," she stated. "But you are at work, as is Father," Jimmy observed. "Mr. Tate will be in the library. I do not think anyone would be able to accompany me." "Perhaps Mr. Anesti?" Jimmy blinked. "He smells." He saw his mother struggle to contain a grin. "Jimmy, he has a strong body odor, it is true. He is also the only adult around who might be able to accompany you, especially if you wish to do it. Today, did you say?" "I do want to do it today," he thought as he nodded. "This is not a situation I believed I was in." "Will you be the one to ask him?" His mother shook her head. "No, I am not the one who wants to go into Rose Hall." Jimmy frowned. "When should I ask him?" "Soon, I would suspect," she replied. "I thought I saw him leave a short time ago." Jimmy nodded. Mr. Anesti always left at 10 in the morning to go for a coffee at the diner and to get groceries. He returned at 5 minutes past 11. Without another word, Jimmy walked to the front window and stood there, waiting to see Mr. Anesti's old red pickup come down the street and pull into the driveway of the old man's house. For half an hour, Jimmy contemplated a variety of arguments against asking Mr. Anesti to accompany him. Jimmy even went so far as to imagine reminding his mother of the various in-school, teacher-led discussions concerning stranger danger and bad touching. But he quickly cast aside that argument. His mother, he knew, would turn the argument around on him and use it to keep him in the house for an extended period. At the end of his mentally exhausting period of contemplation, Jimmy resigned himself to accepting the fate of having Mr. Anesti as a chaperone. 43 minutes after his mother's decision regarding Rose Hall, Jimmy saw Mr. Anesti pull his battered pickup truck into his driveway, parking the vehicle in front of the man's garage. Mr. Anesti never parked in the garage, though Jimmy did not know why. Jimmy counted to 29 before Mr. Anesti opened the driver's side door and got out of the truck. The old man wore a set of much-repaired overalls, ragged work boots, and a flannel shirt that at one time might have been green and black, but it had faded to a muddy brown and dull gray. On his head, Mr. Anesti wore what he always did, a black knit watchman's cap. The edge of it was rolled up and looked almost comical on the old man's head. "If you help him with his groceries," Jimmy's mother said from behind, "he may be more inclined to say yes to your proposition." Jimmy nodded, understanding the truth of his mother's words. "I will go and assist Mr. Anesti," Jimmy stated. Without another word, Jimmy left the house and walked the short distance to Mr. Anesti's home. It was a ramshackle affair that was, when taken with the neighborhood as a whole, out of place. While the lawns of the other residences were well kept and raked, Mr. Anesti rarely cut the grass, and when he did so, it was done in a haphazard fashion. The paint was peeling off the sides of the old New England-style cape the man lived in, and the shutters that remained had broken slats and were heavy with wasps' nests. Jimmy considered all of this as he walked up the cracked sidewalk in front of Mr. Anesti's home. The old man stood by the passenger side of the truck, talking in a language Jimmy did not comprehend. But as he drew closer to Mr. Anesti, the man stopped speaking and turned around. The wind shifted, and the old man's relentless body odor assailed Jimmy's nose. Doing his best to ignore the smell and stopping at the edge of Mr. Anesti's driveway, Jimmy spoke. "Good morning, Mr. Anesti. I was wondering if I could ask for your assistance." One of the old man's large white eyebrows went up in an arch, the thick hair seeming to grow longer and wilder. "You need my assistance?" Mr. Anesti asked. As the words exited his mouth, the air which created them followed, carrying with it the powerful scent of coffee and cigarettes. "I do. I wish to go into Rose Hall." Mr. Anesti peered at him without blinking. "And why, pray tell, would you do that, boy?" Jimmy hesitated, and then he decided that it would be best if he was completely honest with the old man. "I have learned that there may be a ghost in Rose Hall. I wish to confront this." Mr. Anesti grunted. "What if I told you there was?" "I would appreciate the information," Jimmy stated, "but I still would like to confirm the existence." The old man reached into the pocket of his overalls, took out a pack of cigarettes and a lighter, and soon he was smoking. Putting the items back, Mr. Anesti smiled. "So, you are the type who needs to see with their own eyes." Jimmy nodded. "When it comes to proving or disproving the presence of a ghost or some supernatural entity, I must observe it. Otherwise, I will not know for certain if it exists." Mr. Anesti appeared about to make a statement. Then, with a shrug, he tapped the ashes off his cigarette and said, "Help me with my groceries, please, and we will discuss this outing." The old man motioned for Jimmy to come forward, and he did so. By the time he reached the passenger side of the pickup, Mr. Anesti had taken out a large brown bag, and he handed it to Jimmy. Mr. Anesti took a second out of the truck and closed the door. Jimmy followed the man up to the side door, which, it turned out, was unlocked. When Jimmy stepped into the house, he nearly recoiled. His eyes watered from the overpowering stench of garlic mingled with that of raw onions. Through a film of tears, Jimmy saw Mr. Anesti glance at him. "Set the bag on the table, Jimmy Sue," the old man said, and gestured at a small kitchen table set in the corner of the room. Jimmy did so, wiping his eyes and blinking rapidly as he tried to clear them. A moment later, and he could see clearly around him. At once, he saw the source of the odor. Around the window over the sink, there was a string of freshly peeled garlic and onions. As he looked closer, Jimmy saw there was a thick line of salt on the sill, and what looked to be a small series of iron figures made from bent nails. His eyes wandered, and Jimmy realized there weren't any dishes he could see, nor any pots or pans. The kitchen was bare. When he looked over to Mr. Anesti, he saw the old man was watching him. "Why don't you go and take a seat in the living room? It's through that doorway there," Mr. Anesti suggested, motioning toward it. Jimmy nodded and left the room, stepping into a neat and well-cared-for living room. There was no dust anywhere he could see, no hint of anything which might be out of place. The room was not what he had expected, given the old man's appearance and body odor. Jimmy walked forward to a bookshelf at the room's far end. While there were no books on it, the shelves were populated with small bits of men's jewelry. Jimmy saw 2 class rings, 1 wedding band, and 8 dog tags. There was also a photograph of a large warship on the top shelf. The name of the ship was on a small bronze legend attached to the front edge of the shelf. USS Indianapolis, Jimmy read. Jimmy had seen the name before, but he had never read anything about it. He knew it was a ship and that it had delivered a weapon in World War II. Nothing more. "They were good men," Mr. Anesti said, and there was sadness in his voice. Jimmy turned and looked at the man. "Who were they?" "Sailors, friends, and shipmates," Mr. Anesti answered. He smiled and shook his head as the smile faded. "They took me in. I wasn't much older than you. Looked older, mind you. Acted it when I had to. I didn't want to miss the fight. Well, I didn't." The old man sighed. "That's neither here nor there now, is it?" Jimmy shook his head, uncertain as to whether the question was rhetorical. "Sit, Jimmy, sit." Mr. Anesti nodded to a high-backed rocking chair, its dark wood polished and almost glowing in the morning light. As the old man took a seat on the small chaise lounge, Jimmy sat in the rocking chair. The windows in the room, like the window in the kitchen, were framed by strings of garlic and onions, their sills thick with salt and protected by bent iron figurines. "What do you keep out of your home?" Jimmy asked. Mr. Anesti raised an eyebrow. "You don't miss a trick, do you?" "I do upon occasion," Jimmy replied. Mr. Anesti chuckled. "Ah, you're one of those. All right, all right. You noticed the protections I put around the windows?" "Yes." "Fair enough. I keep out anything that might want to get in. Anything that shouldn't be in here," Mr. Anesti answered. "People?" Jimmy asked, although he was sure he knew the answer to the question. Mr. Anesti's expression was almost feral. "Ain't too many people I know who are still alive, and those that are, well, I don't want them here. Feelings mutual, by the by." "What, then, do you keep at bay?" Jimmy asked again. "Garlic for the vampire, yes. Onions, though? Salt is for ghosts. Iron, too, although it may well be for the fairy folk." Mr. Anesti nodded and then answered, "Onions are to mask my scent. I'm alive because of it." "You don't use soap at all?" Jimmy asked, surprised. "The garlic and onions work better. That's also why there aren't any plates or silverware, pots or pans," the old man answered with a grin. "I'll wipe things down and sweep, but I can't have anything that would keep my scent." He rubbed at his chin. "I don't want to leave a trail for them to follow," he muttered. "I don't want to show them where I live." Jimmy waited for the man to continue, and then he saw Mr. Anesti was watching him. Jimmy frowned. "What is it?" "You didn't react as though I'm crazy or senile," Mr. Anesti answered. "Most folks assume I'm not all there upstairs anymore." "I do not assume anything," Jimmy replied. "You could be quite insane, dangerously so, but I will not know until we have spent some time together." "And you would have that time at King's Academy, searching Rose Hall?" Mr. Anesti asked. "I would," Jimmy agreed. "What if there is something other than a ghost at the school?" the old man inquired, his voice becoming low and gentle. "What if, mind you, there's something far deadlier than a ghost who won't go to their reward?" "Then this will be dealt with," Jimmy answered. "Have you dealt with things other than ghosts?" Mr. Anesti asked. Jimmy considered how to respond and decided that the whole truth would be necessary when dealing with Mr. Anesti. "Yes," Jimmy responded. "I have had interactions with a vampire, troll, giant, and several other types of fairy folk. There have also been some monsters that I have no name for." "Were they difficult?" the old man inquired. "Of course." The smile returned to Mr. Anesti's face, and he nodded approvingly. "Good. Any answer other than that would have made this a fool's errand for you. I will tell you this, Jimmy. I'm not exactly sure what's occupying King's Academy. Some people have gone in and vanished over the years." Jimmy frowned. "I did not read of such events." "Most people don't remember that it happened to begin with," Mr. Anesti informed him. "And if they can't remember, then they can't write it down. And if they can't write it down, then people won't know to avoid the academy." "If they do not know to avoid the academy," Jimmy reasoned, "then they are doomed to repeat the mistakes of those who went before them." "Who would benefit from such a situation?" The old man's voice was low and careful as he asked the question, and Jimmy knew this was a small test of his intelligence. "A predator," Jimmy stated. Mr. Anesti nodded approvingly. "Exactly. A predator. How do you think such a predator could erase the memory of a person? Destroy every thought anyone ever had of them?" Jimmy blinked, confused. "That is not a possibility." "Do you know Finn McLeod?" Mr. Anesti asked. Jimmy opened his mouth to say he did not, then he closed it. The name was familiar. He could see a piece of paper nestled in the depths of his memory. Frowning, Jimmy closed his eyes and focused on that memory. It was as though cobwebs had been draped across it. Something tried to block him, to stop Jimmy from accessing his own personal library, and anger and confusion rose in him. He shoved them aside, and the page leaped forward. Jimmy leaned over the page, which was part of his 6th grade yearbook. Finn McLeod was several students after Jimmy's own photograph, and Finn was grinning at the camera. His cheeks were spotted with freckles, his red hair wild and unkempt. Finn was the middle child of 5, all of them red-haired and raucous when in class. Jimmy remembered Finn. He could distinctly recall that the other boy had discussed Rose Hall, and of spending the night with a cousin to see if the ghost were real. Jimmy opened his eyes. "Where is Finn McLeod? It has been 2 years." "Finn McLeod died almost 2 years ago," Mr. Anesti answered, his voice filled with bitterness and sorrow. "As did his cousin. There wasn't much but bones left of them when I pulled their bodies out last Christmas." "How can they be forgotten?" Jimmy demanded. "Tell me. I know Finn had 4 siblings. His cousin, he once told us, had 7 brothers and 2 sisters. How can all these people have forgotten Finn and his cousin?" "Because she can make them forget," Mr. Anesti answered. Jimmy shook his head. a strange twist of fear blossoming in his belly. "I do not know of any such creature who could make us forget. How is it you do not forget?" "I have known too much tragedy," Mr. Anesti responded. "I have seen too much death. It is impossible for me to forget it. But I am a rarity, Jimmy, and it is why she came to a town like Anger. This is a small place. If she gets to a child young, if they are natives of the area and not well-traveled, then she can make this small, insular place forget." A throbbing pain settled into the back of Jimmy's skull. It was as though his mind was fighting against some force that sought to numb him from the truth once more. "No," he told himself, "I will not forget. This is not acceptable, not at all." Looking at Mr. Anesti, he asked, "How many others have vanished?" "Since I came home from the war?" Jimmy nodded. 29 from Anger. I have found the bones of at least 10 others. There might be more if she was hungry enough," Mr. Anesti answered. "Where is she?" "In Rose Hall," the old man stated. "It is her home. No one checks on it. No one thinks to. And if there is, for some reason, a person who decides to, well, they end up in the pot, don't they?" "The pot," Jimmy repeated. "She eats them all." "Every last one of them," Mr. Anesti confirmed. "Waste not, want not is something she lives by." "What is she?" "A witch," Mr. Anesti responded. "As in with a pointy nose?" "As in Hansel and Gretel," the old man stated. "She eats them," Jimmy repeated. Mr. Anesti nodded. "Can she be destroyed?" Jimmy asked. The old man blinked, his face reddened, and he answered in a hoarse voice, "I don't know." "Have you tried?" There was no condemnation or accusation in his question. Mr. Anesti bristled for a moment, but then he regained his composure. "I have. Twice. Each time did not end well for me, and I am surprised I'm alive." Jimmy frowned. "I must review what I know of witches." "When do you want to come back?" the old man asked. Jimmy shook his head. "It will only be a moment." Before Mr. Anesti could speak again, Jimmy closed his eyes, stepping into his private mental library. He quickly found the book on witches and witchcraft, and he flipped through the pages, seeking and finding that which he needed. Opening his eyes, he saw Mr. Anesti was staring at him. "What did you do?" the old man asked, a note of curiosity in his voice. "I looked up the information required to destroy the witch," Jimmy told him. "How?" "I remember everything I read," Jimmy answered. "Everything?" Mr. Anesti narrowed his eyes. "Photographic memory. Yes, your mother has mentioned that before." Jimmy nodded. "It remains in my brain. I have created a library in my mind. At any time, I can walk down the aisles and retrieve a book or information. It does not take long." "You were perfectly still for 10 minutes, Mr. Anesti responded. "That was much longer than usual. I apologize." Mr. Anesti shook his head and chuckled. "Tell me, Jimmy, what did you remember?" "I learned that it is not good to burn a witch," Jimmy stated. "From what I read, this gives the witch too much time to either affect a curse or to escape into the body of the familiar. The preferred method is hanging, although it has been stated in the Middle East and the Far East that strangulation or garroting works well also." "I don't think we can hang her," Mr. Anesti mused. "That would take a few more hands than just ours, and I don't know that we could get them to help. Hanging a woman for witchcraft wouldn't be a good thing for most." "That is true," Jimmy agreed. They would believe both of us to be either mentally deficient or unstable. Either way, we would be unable to carry out the task of removing the witch. Mr. Anstey nodded. Do you know what garroting is, Jimmy? Yes, I have read of it. Mr. Anstey finished his cigarette, paused, and then lit another. It would be a hard thing to do. Yes, Jimmy agreed. Does she prefer to eat children? The question took the old man by surprise, and he nearly dropped his cigarette. I think she does, he answered after a moment. Yes, in fact, there is a small chapel in the school, and I have seen, well, mementos are the best way to describe them. A lot of them are children's things, ribbons, toys, a few photographs. I will use myself as bait. Jimmy looked at the old man. He saw the protest forming on Mr. Anstey's lips as the man took his cigarette out of his mouth. Jimmy held up a hand, forestalling the argument. There is no other choice. I will be seen as a delicacy, a child wantonly walking into her lair. You would not be such a pleasant meal, I think. But if you die, Mr. Anstey began, his voice tight. You alone will remember, Jimmy stated. It will be a burden, of that I am sure, but you already know that it will not affect my parents, not for any length of time. The witch will make certain of that. You're a strange boy, Jimmy, Mr. Anstey remarked. Jimmy nodded. I know this. Do you have something you could use as a garrote? Mr. Anstey chuckled bitterly, murmuring, Such a strange question to be asked by anyone, let alone a child. Jimmy didn't respond. Yes, Mr. Anstey stated, a little louder a moment later. Yes, I do. Give me a moment. Jimmy remained where he was as the old man stood and left the room. A moment later, Jimmy heard a door open and then the sound of feet on stairs. There was a rustling sound beneath his feet as Mr. Anstey looked for something in the basement. After several minutes, a harsh laugh came up through the floorboards, and the old man returned shortly, carrying with him a length of thick, off-white rope. It was, Jimmy surmised, long enough to serve the purpose they needed it for. Do we need anything else? Mr. Anstey asked, a calm tone of deference in his voice. Bring iron, Jimmy stated. Do you have some? Mr. Anstey inquired as he went to a side table, opened the drawer, and withdrew a large iron railroad spike. Jimmy nodded. I do. I didn't know iron would work against a witch, the old man murmured. I am not certain it will, Jimmy replied, but I do know it works on many different supernatural beings. Mr. Anstey grunted his agreement and turned to face Jimmy. Are you ready? Yes. You don't need to tell your mom? Jimmy shook his head. My mother is fully aware of the reason behind this trip. She does not believe. Few do, Mr. Anstey stated, his eyes flicking to his shipmate's items. Come on. Jimmy followed the old man out of the house and shuddered as he took in a deep breath of fresh air. He loathed the idea of getting into the truck with Mr. Anstey and the man's odor, but he knew there was no choice. Not if I want to stop this witch, Jimmy thought, getting into the truck. Like the house, the truck was clean. Even the ashtray held only a few stubbed-out cigarette butts, and Jimmy suspected that they would be gone soon enough. If we survive, he reminded himself. Mr. Anstey started up the truck, rolled down his window, and Jimmy did the same, pausing for a moment before understanding how the window worked. You've never seen an old window crank, huh? Mr. Anstey asked, backing the truck out of the driveway. I have not. I did read about them once, Jimmy replied. I found a manual for a 1974 Volkswagen Beetle. When did you read that? Mr. Anstey inquired, guiding the truck toward King's Academy. I was 6, Jimmy stated. 6? There was surprise in the old man's voice. Jimmy nodded. I still am not sure what most of the words mean. The manual was in German. And you still memorized it? Mr. Anesti shook his head. It is not a choice, Jimmy informed him. I remember what I see on the page. They continued in silence, Jimmy memorizing the exact route they were following. It was best to do so, he had discovered. If he didn't pay attention and something happened, he would not be able to get home easily. If Mr. Anesti dies, I do not want to have to call my mother to inform her of it and ask for a ride home. It would cause her no small amount of distress. Are you always quiet? Jimmy looked at the old man. Yes. The man nodded. In the distance, glimpsed over the tops of the trees, the battered peak of the tower at King's Academy stood against the morning sky. I'm glad you came to my house this morning, Jimmy. Why is that? Jimmy asked. Because you said you've dealt with strange creatures before. And this is a good thing to have done? Yes, Mr. Anesti said. I believe it is. The town needs a protector. All small New England towns do. We're ripe for picking, as you can see. Yes, Jimmy agreed. I can see it. After several more minutes of driving, they arrived at King's Academy. The old school's dull red bricks soaked up the sunlight, and the proud elms along the property's perimeter cast long shadows across the cracked and broken asphalt. None of the school's tall and narrow windows were broken, though they appeared faded with age. I should have asked this before, Mr. Anesti said, parking the truck across from the building's main entrance. How are we supposed to get in? In the past, I've snuck in. Lately, I've been feeling my age, though. I'm not quite sure I can get in that way again. The front door will be unlocked, Jimmy assured him. I was told it would be. Mr. Anesti appeared as though he was about to ask how, and then the man shook his head. Shutting the engine down, he took the key out, put it in the front pocket of his overalls, and asked, Ready? No, Jimmy answered, opening the door. But I will do my best. The two of them closed the truck's doors and advanced on the school. Jimmy focused on the entrance and felt odd, as if he was dizzy. You feel it, Mr. Anesti murmured. Jimmy nodded. What is it? Her magic, Mr. Anesti answered. It's a glam of sorts. It pushes and pulls. She doesn't want anyone here. Not right now. She must have fed recently then, Jimmy surmised. Or she is preparing to feed. Mr. Anesti winced, and Jimmy saw him tighten his grip on the length of rope he carried. They reached the door, and Jimmy took hold of the large latch. He pressed down on the thumb plate, and the click of the door opening was loud and harsh in his ear. When he pulled the door open, a soft cinnamon scent wafted out. Mr. Anesti pulled back, covering his nose. Jimmy peered at him, confused. Look past the glam, Jimmy, the old man suggested. Look past it and tell me what you smell. Jimmy focused on the hall beyond the door, the dim light of the day illuminating the tiled floor and the old and empty trophy cases. As he did so, he pushed his consciousness beyond the smell of cinnamon, and then he reeled back. Mr. Anesti's hand caught Jimmy's shoulder and steadied him. The rank, foul odor of rotting meat assailed Jimmy's nose, and he struggled against the desire to vomit. Here. Mr. Anesti pressed a cigarette into Jimmy's hand. I do not smoke, Jimmy stated, letting go of the door and turning away for a moment. Mr. Anesti smiled. Break it in half, Jimmy. Place one half into one nostril, then the second into the other. It helps block the smell. Jimmy did so and asked, Why are you not doing the same? It doesn't bother me, Mr. Anesti explained. Nothing about death bothers me. It hasn't for a long time. How do we get to her? "This way to Rose Hall." Mr. Ernesti nodded toward the door. "Once we go through it, we take the first set of stairs and go to the second floor. From there, it's a short walk to the upper level of Rose Hall and the King's Academy Library. She stays hidden in the library or in the classroom closest to it. I've found human remains in the kitchen. That's where she cooks them." Jimmy stopped himself from replying that the kitchen was the obvious place to cook a meal. Such a statement, he knew, was unnecessary. Where else would a person cook their food? Mr. Ernesti took a step toward the door, but Jimmy shook his head. "No, I must be the first in," Jimmy reminded the old man. "I am the bait. I am the delicacy. It is your task to wait, at least a little." Without listening for a response from Mr. Ernesti, Jimmy opened the door and stepped into King's Academy. The air was moist against his skin, a strange and foul heat attached to it. Despite the cigarettes in his nostrils, Jimmy still smelled the powerful odor of decay that hung in the air. With Mr. Ernesti's directions clear in his mind, Jimmy walked forward. Soon he was at the stairs, climbing up them and noticing the small tracks in the thick dust. They were from mice, he was certain, but they shimmered as much as the door had when he had first approached the school's entrance. Jimmy focused and frowned. A variety of footprints were revealed as the glam fell away. He saw prints from sneakers and shoes, even those made from bare feet. Reaching the second landing, he found the door slightly ajar, and he eased it open. The hinges complained bitterly, but not too loudly, and for that Jimmy was grateful. Once on the second floor, Jimmy paused, allowing his eyes to adjust to the low light. "I did not even bring a flashlight," he realized. "I was not thinking. I was confused by the conversation I had with Mr. Ernesti. I must be certain not to do such a thing again." Jimmy looked down the short hallway, saw several doors were closed, and then hanging from the ceiling at the far end of the hall, he caught sight of a sign. Even in the dim light, he was able to read what it said. Library. Jimmy walked toward it and turned to the right, following the path of the arrow. Ahead, there was a closed door, and on it was stenciled library. "I hope," Jimmy thought, striding toward the door, "she is not hungry at this time, and that I am too thin for her tastes. Perhaps I will die, but at least I will not be eaten." Jimmy reached the door, raised his hand as a closed fist, and knocked 3 times on the hard wood. There was no response. He knocked again. After a moment of silence, Jimmy opened the door and stepped into the library. The smell of death was not as severe as it had been in the hall. What he detected was a slight odor of sage and parsley. He sniffed, his nose wrinkling for a heartbeat as he detected a sour layer to the scent, but it was gone almost as soon as he noticed it. "She is here," he thought, looking around the shelves. He was surprised to find them full. Advancing farther into the room, he peered at some of the titles on the nearest shelf and saw that he could not read them. The language was nothing he had seen before. His fingers itched to pluck a title down and open it, but he knew that if he did so, then he would promptly sit on the floor and read every word in the text, despite his inability to understand it. "It is bright in here," he realized, and turning his attention to the walls, he saw brass sconces with glass shades in the shape of globes and the color of honey. A curious light emanated from them, and Jimmy wondered what sort of bulbs might be found within them. Shifting his focus away from the lights, Jimmy walked down the center aisle of the small library. He passed by the tall wooden bookcases, making his way to a large, beautifully carved desk at the end. As he drew closer, Jimmy saw the carvings illustrated a magnificent feast with several platters on a long table. The platters were occupied by headless human forms, each trussed up like a Christmas turkey. Around the table, seated in tall chairs, were men and women. All were hideous to gaze upon, their bodies twisted and mangled, noses overlong, and their hair hanging in rat-tailed clumps. "Have you come for a book?" Jimmy stopped where he was and stared at the desk. For the first time, he saw a woman seated behind it. She was petite, her face narrow and pinched. Her nose was almost a caricature due to its length. Warts and blemishes dotted her skin, and her sickly yellow hair, like that of the dinner guests in the carving, was a rat's nest of tangles. Her eyes, gray and silver combined, were quick and left no doubt within him about her intelligence. The power in the witch's gaze left no doubt within him of the danger she presented. "No," Jimmy answered. "I did not come for a book." She raised an eyebrow. "Why come here, then?" "I came to learn of the ghost in Rose Hall," Jimmy stated. "But I learned instead of a witch." A grin flickered across her face. "Did you?" He nodded. "Yes, I have learned of those you have killed." The grin returned. "You're speaking nonsense, boy?" "No," Jimmy shook his head. "Not at all. You have the ability to cast a glam. I am curious." "What are you curious about?" From the corners of his eyes, Jimmy saw movement, but he did not turn toward them. "Should you die," he began, "will the glam die with you?" "I don't know," she answered. "I've never died." "Ah." Jimmy nodded and clasped his hands behind his back. "A pity. I had hoped you were smarter." She bristled at his statement. "I am far smarter than you will ever be, especially, as the saying goes, since you wandered into my parlor, little fly." Jimmy frowned, then nodded. "Yes, the spider and the fly. I do know this story. I do not believe it is applicable at this time." "You're a strange boy," she observed. "How is this not applicable?" "The fly had been lured in. Me, I have come here to destroy you." The witch stood up, and an electrical charge surged through the air. She was as small standing as she had looked when seated. Her clothes were cast-offs or stolen from the dead, and she did not seem to care that they were ill-fitting. She limped around the desk, her fingers curling and relaxing as she moved toward him. "Do you know how long I have been alive?" she asked. Jimmy shook his head. "I do not care. That information is irrelevant." She stepped a little closer, her back straightening, her body elongating, her face becoming fuller, her hair darkened and lengthened. As he watched, her skin lost its pasty, off-white coloring and took on a soft, rich tone as the witch's face mimicked his mother. In Cantonese, the witch whispered, "I know who you are, Jimmy Sue. Do you think your name is unknown to us? Did you know that I have been waiting for you to wander in, curious little meal?" The resemblance to his mother was nearly complete, but despite the witch's skill, she could not abolish the malice in her eyes. Jimmy had no difficulty ignoring her appearance. "I am curious what you hope to accomplish by taking on the form of my mother," he stated in Cantonese. The witch blinked, and her appearance wavered momentarily, showing the witch beneath. "She does not speak or understand Cantonese. It was glam, nothing more." Jimmy continued his questions in his parents' native tongue. "How long have you been here?" he asked. The witch glared at him, and as she did so, her hair transformed back to the rat's nest it had been previously. She did not notice. "I have been waiting to eat you," she hissed. The words came out doubled, a mixture of Cantonese and English. "Why did you choose this town?" Jimmy kept his question vague, not wanting to give her the name of anger, not wishing to allow her any sort of intellectual ground to stand on. "She wants me afraid. Why? Does this appeal to her?" "Does fear make the taste of flesh sweeter to you?" "Shut up!" she snarled, and she was no longer his mother. Her fingers uncurled, the light of the wall sconces glowing dull and hideous in her cracked black nails. "I will flay you alive, boy!" He stepped around her, allowing himself to be placed between the witch and the desk. When he did so, he saw Mr. Anesti step into the doorway. The witch remained ignorant of the man, her attention focused upon Jimmy. She stepped forward, and Jimmy stepped back, pressing himself against the desk. As his hands took hold of the wood, he shuddered with revulsion. It was warm, pulsating to the touch, and he knew it was alive, somehow. "Do you like the feel of it?" she crowed. "It is a delight, is it not?" "No," Jimmy answered in Cantonese. "It is a foul sensation, but you do not know what I am saying." He smiled at her and saw rage settle on her face. "I will keep you alive," she told him, pointing a long, thin finger at him. "I will fatten you up, and when you are plump, I will eat you a bit at a time. You, Jimmy Sue, I will savor. Then, when I speak to my kith and kin, I'll brag about how long you suffered." "But you will not," Jimmy switched to English. "You will be unable to tell anyone about anything." She opened her mouth to reply, then her nose twitched, her nostrils flared, and Mr. Anesti's garrote slipped over her head. The old man twisted the rope and pressed down, driving her to her knees as she tried to scratch at his arms. Jimmy leaped forward, caught her wrists, and pinned them together. The witch struggled against them both, but Mr. Anesti's weight kept her on the floor, and Jimmy refused to let go of her, despite the obscene power from her thin frame. Jimmy heard her gasp, heard the witch start to speak, and he said, "Tighter!" Mr. Anesti twisted the rope again, crushing her larynx and collapsing her throat, but still she fought on. Mr. Anesti bore down upon her, and her eyes bulged from their sockets. Spittle flecked out from her mouth as her tongue shot forward. She jerked her arms up, trying to dislodge Jimmy, but he only tightened his grip and dropped his center of gravity, denying her of what little strength she had left. As he pulled back, the witch's efforts weakened, though the hatred in her eyes did not. Finally, the light faded from her eyes, and she went limp. Neither he nor Mr. Anesti relaxed. Instead, they held their positions for another 5 minutes, and then they collapsed. As the rope slackened around the witch, her body twitched, convulsed, and became dust. The mismatched clothes sank to the floor, and Jimmy stared, waiting to see if her apparent death was nothing more than another attempt at glam. It was not. Jimmy sat up, his hands aching. Mr. Anesti put his rope back into his pocket. Then he took out a cigarette and lit it. Exhaling through his nose, he peered at Jimmy, smiled, and then laughed, shaking his head as he did so. "What is funny?" Jimmy inquired. Mr. Anesti laughed even harder for a few moments. When he regained control over himself, he answered the question. "Jimmy, we just killed a witch." Jimmy nodded. "It is what we set out to do." Mr. Anesti chuckled. That we did. Are you ready to go home? Jimmy shook his head. You need a few more minutes? The old man inquired. More than that, Jimmy stated, getting to his feet. Why? Mr. Anstey asked. I want to see if there is indeed a ghost here in Rose Hall. Jimmy looked at the old man. My mother will want to know. I am unable to lie to her. Mr. Anstey grinned and got slowly to his feet. All right, Jimmy. Let's go downstairs and see what we can see. Together they walked out of the library, and Jimmy glanced back. He saw the pile of dust and old clothes, the foul desk, and the books lining the shelves. The lights flickered in their sconces, and Jimmy turned away. I will need to return, he thought, closing the door behind him. There are books in here which I must read. Together, he and Mr. Anstey headed toward the stairs.
Are you looking for more creepy horror stories? Click the link in the description or search Scare Street on Audible for a list of all our bone-chilling titles. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more spooky videos from Scare Street. See you in the shadows.